Welcome to the Two Boots Word Vault podcast. This episode is a recording of a story collected by William Butler Yeats, The Wisdom of the King, which I told to the men of the Australian group, The Fifth Direction, and to the Men's Folktale Gardening Club of Minnesota.
I want to tell a story that I found of 40 years ago. And this story is from Ireland. My mother, 90% of her blood was Irish. The other 10% was a mixture of Welsh, English, and Scottish. So this story, when I found it, rang true with me because I've been a seeker ever since I was a boy. The story is The Wisdom of the King. Now in old Ireland, the High Queen of Ireland died while giving birth to her child. And so the child was put to nurse with a woman who lived on the edge of the great dark woods. One evening, while the woman was wondering and marveling at the beautiful baby in the cradle, she prayed that the gods would give that baby wisdom to equal his beauty. And as she was staring down at the cradle and the beautiful face, a knock came at the door. And she said, "Who's there?" And she heard this thin voice say, "Open. I am the crone of the gray hawk, and I come from the darkness of the great woods." The nurse went to the door, unbolted the door, and in walked a woman, an old, ancient woman who was much taller than the average human being, dressed completely in gray. The old woman walked to the head of the cradle, and in the gleam of the firelight, the nurse could see that instead of hair growing on the old woman's head were the feathers of the gray hawk. And the nurse trembled. And then she heard another knock at the door, and a voice said, "Open, for I am a crone of the great gray hawk, and I look over his nest in the deep, dark woods." And trembling, the nurse opened up the door. In walked a second woman, as tall and as old and ancient as the first. And behind her came a third, and then a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh. And they circled the cradle, and they looked down on the cradle. And after moments of silence, the third crone said, "I saw him from far off because of the redness of his heart beneath his silver skin." And then the fourth crone said, "I knew him because his heart trembled like a bird trapped in a net of silver cords." And then the fifth one said, "I knew him because his heart sang like a bird, happy in a silver cage." And they stood looking silently, smiling down on that baby's face. Then they began to sing a chant or a song in an ancient tongue that no one remembers. And the song sounded like the wind through the leaves of the trees falling in autumn. And after a while, when the song ebbed, and a sixth one said, "Sisters, all we have to do now is mix a bit of our blood with his." And the seventh crone took the spindle, scratched herself on the arm, dropped some blood, blood as gray as the mist, onto the lips of that baby. Then slowly the crones left that small hut. The nurse gathered up her courage and ran as fast as she could to the High King's house, which is a mile away. She ran into the assembly hall and started saying, "The Sidhe have looked over the baby in the cradle. The Sidhe have looked down on that child." And the king and the poets and the men of law ran with that nurse back to the hut. And they gathered around the cradle, and they were gossiping and chattering and confused and talking. They sounded like magpies. And the child opened his eyes and sat up and watched them. 2 years passed, and the king went off to war and was killed. The poets and the men of law ruled in the name of the child. And things went well in that kingdom. And the child became the master of himself as a very young child. Except for one thing. It was a miracle, a little miracle, for miracles were very common in those days. But the feathers of the gray hawk grew out of the hair of that child. And although the nurse trimmed and cut those feathers as they came in, the feathers continued to multiply on the child's head. That was not too much of a problem for everyone, because things were going smoothly. Except they were all horrified by the thought that maybe the king would understand the ancient law of Ireland that said no man with a blemish or flaw of body can sit on the throne of Ireland. And they worried about that. For they had suffered under the reign of foolish kings. And things continued in a good way. The wise boy continued to study and rule. And he studied strange and subtle things, mysterious things. He was curious about spiritual things and the patterns of the universe. And when he grew to be 7 years old, the chief poet called the poets and the men of law together to consider all of these things, because the young king had seen that everyone else did not have feathers growing through their hair. And when he asked them about it, they said, "Well, we used to have feathers, but there was sin committed by our forefathers." And they worried about this because they knew that as soon as the king would wander around his realm, do the circuit, he would see that everybody else was without feathers. So they made a law that said that everyone had to wear feathers of the gray hawk in their hair. And if anyone did not, they would be put to death. And if anyone told the king of this law, they too would be put to death. And the king ruled, and he ruled wisely. If it was an issue about raising crops, taking care of the animals and the livestock, he would turn to one of the other men of law, one of the other men in the court, have them make that answer. And things continued in a good way. And that king grew from childhood, boyhood, adulthood. And his wisdom grew as he continued studying the laws and patterns of the universe. And his wisdom was known around the world. And people came to visit and ask his advice. Now, because of the law, that the poets and the men of law had created, as soon as these people came to the border, they were forced to put feathers into their hair. And they would come and sit before him, and they would ask his advice. And if a man came and had a noble heart and had done wonderful things for a good cause, the king praised him. However, when that man returned to his home, that which he loved seemed less lovable. And when someone came that was only concerned about themselves, about their own personal peace and welfare, they took the words from the king, those words that seemed to make the darkness light, words that made the heart seem to sing. And they would go home. And when they got home, they would realize that they were no longer interested in toiling in the soil. Their muscles grew weak. For the king had shown them a greater purpose. And young ones had heard about this king, and they came to visit him and ask his advice. And they came and they sat at his knees, listening to everything he said. And the way he spoke filled their minds with wonder about extraordinary joys. And when they returned home, they weren't able to enjoy ordinary joys, and they grew unhappy. For that king had been demonstrating that there is so little that divides the false and the true. And he showed them that there were differences among things that they thought were similar and alike, and that there were resemblances between things that seemed very far apart and very distant. Now, among the young ones who came, a beautiful woman, a princess, came from a small kingdom. And she had an uncommon beauty, a beauty that surpassed that of other women. An extraordinary beauty. But her heart was like that of ordinary women. And the king, when he saw this beauty, he was smitten and fell in love. And he gave her gifts, exotic gifts from around the world. And he told her secrets. All of the things that filled him with interest, he spilled to her, laid that out before her, because he thought that because of her extraordinary beauty, she could understand what he was saying. But she had a sense of horror about the feathers in his hair and about the mysterious and subtle things that he spoke of. And she accepted his gifts with a bit of yielding to him and a bit of withholding. And when she was in his presence, her face was halfway between a frown and a smile. One day the king went walking down by the river, and there were sally bushes between the river and where he walked. And as he walked, he heard a voice that he recognized. It was the yellow-haired young man who took care of his horses. This was a young man, a tall young man, who loved to wrestle. He loved the exuberance of athletic competitions. He loved the sweat and the smell of the horses and of the land. That young man said these words, "Oh, darling, It makes me angry that you have to wear the feathers of the gray hawk in your beautiful hair just so that bird of prey who sits on the throne can sleep easily at night." And a woman replied, a voice that the king recognized. And the voice said, "Darling, let me take the feathers from your blonde hair so I can stroke your hair, run my fingers through your hair like this, and when I do, I'm no longer afraid." And at that moment, when the king heard that beautiful princess's words, he remembered words that slipped out of the poets and the men of law, things that he rationalized away, words that didn't seem to make sense to him at the time, but he rationalized them to himself. So he called forth the young man and the woman and said, "Come here, come here." And they came out and they knelt down and they asked for his pardon. He didn't say a word. He bent over and he pulled the feathers from the hair of the beautiful woman and let them fall on the ground. Then he turned and walked back to the assembly hall and he gathered the poets and the men of law. And when they all were together, he stood at the dais and in a loud voice he said, "Men of law, why did you make me sin against the law? Men of verse, why did you make me sin against the secrecy of wisdom? Because the law is made by man for the welfare of man. And wisdom is a gift from the gods. And wisdom, like the rain and the hail and the thunder and the lightning, follow a way that is deadly to mortal beings. Call on Yohi of the hasty mind to reign in my place. For he is of your kind. And I'm going to leave and look and search for my kindred." And he turned, walked down to the assembly, went to each man and pulled the feathers out of their hair. He let the feathers all cover the floor. And when all of the men of law and the poets had their feathers removed, the king walked out without a word. And the last anyone saw of him, he was disappearing into the dark woods. They never saw him again. And while I was rehearsing this story, a flock of dingy sparrows descended on the lawn outside of my porch. And they were chattering and gossiping, and one sparrow flew up onto the bird bath, got a drink of water, turned to the other sparrows and said, "Hey, brother sparrows, have you been listening to the story that human is telling us on his porch? Well, I know that king is still alive. He lives in the hollow of a lightning-struck oak tree beside a river where the salmon thrive." Now, fellas, you know as well as I do that you can't always trust gossipy sparrows. And I'm not sure if the king is still alive, but you know as much as I do, and that is my story, and I'm going to stand by it.